Dear colleagues, we are going to continue with our section called War and Violence, and our next speaker, Egor Sokolov, independent researcher from Moscow. His paper is on, there was a period of time when we were afraid to say that it is possible to put up a defense, the Soviet military strategy in the 1930s. Egor, please go ahead. Thank you, dear colleagues. It's a great honor for me to participate in today's conference. I would like to talk to you about the preliminary results of my research to study Soviet strategic thinking in the 1930s. I will continue with the research that I started. I was looking at Soviet perceptions of Karl Krause's theory of war, and I started with the most well-known military works. I then decided that it might make sense, rather than working with individual important texts, but to work with a whole collection of war theoretical publications. As far as I know, this has not been done before, and today I would like to present the first results of my work, of my analysis of the articles in the Military Thought Journal for the 1930s and the 1940s. And I have to admit that this is very raw still, so please be condescending, and I would definitely appreciate any feedback you might have. I'm really hoping to get this analysis to finalize it. It might be a challenge because I'm currently an independent researcher, and that's a role that does not presuppose any institutional support. I'm trying to define the contours of professional thinking of military professionals and to understand what the Soviet strategy was at the beginning of the Second World War. I'm going to try to tie this in with the defeats that we suffered in 1941 on the one hand, and on the other hand, I'm going to try to understand how political and military violence are interrelated, how the military professional thinking is interrelated with the Stalin regime. First and foremost, I would like to start with a brief description of the context. It's well known, of course. It's clear that in the 1920s, there is an increase in the opportunities to theorize, and these would narrow down towards the 1930s. So how does this actually happen? I will just briefly go over the results of my research of Clausewitz's reception, because I think it's very exemplary. It's a very interesting case study in the sense the Marxist perceptions begin in the mid-19th centuries, and this remained superficial and fragmented for a long time. Engels, for instance, who the Marxists now consider to be the chief expert on military affairs, does not work with Clausewitz's theory practically at all and does not reference him in his military works. Lenin reads Clausewitz, so I guess in 1915, at least that's when he starts to use him against those he refers to as opportunistic socialists, that under the name of patriotism would put forward the chauvinistic bourgeois ideas. Lenin references him occasionally in 1915 and in 1918 again, when he is fighting against leftist Marxists that would contest the Brest Peace Agreement. He's trying to appeal to an authority, and essentially this changes nothing in the way he structures his arguments. His arguments are well known, and there's practically no change to the theory from the beginning of the First War. This is a slogan of turning imperialistic wars into civil war. A result of this way to refer to Clausewitz turns into legitimizing him in military research. And this is something that's done in the 1920s and the 1930s by military professionals, ex-officers of the Tsar Army that back in the day were working in the general headquarters of the Red Army. For instance, Alexander Svechin and Andrei Slesarev, to give you a few names. There is a lot of impressive research, lots of publications, translations of Clausewitz. There's lots of commentary that's published, but in the 1930s, repressions put an end to this effort. I'm not going to go too far into detail. This is not the key focus of my paper today. But nonetheless, I think it's important to set the context to understand this overall logic, because I think this case exemplifies it. I would like to start off with some key points of the Marxist war philosophy. In Socialism and War, Lenin writes that applied to war, the key dialectic law boils down to the fact that war is a continuation of politics, but with different means. This is Clausewitz's formula, and he adds that that was exactly what Marx and Engels believed. They perceived the war as a continuation of a policy of the given states and the various classes within the states in a given moment in time. So according to Lenin, the Marxist war philosophy springboards from Clausewitz's formula, but the differences here are in the way politics are interpreted in the materialistic theory, namely talking about the predetermination of the politics by the class state and the economics. So wars, according to Lenin, are led by states, by governments, representing the policy of the supreme class, fighting to maintain the current order of things, which is defined by their place in the social production context. We know how that goes. In the Soviet Union, these concepts become the common sense behind discussions of strategy. They cannot be criticized directly, but they become a very convenient framework for military experts to develop a sort of strategic analysis internally. Historic materialism and strategic analysis can initially coexist. The problem is, nonetheless, that this Marxist theory, starting from the 1930s, starts to actively adjust to the needs of the given moment. For instance, the Marxist thesis that the social economic regime defines the military structure turns into a propagandistic slogan on the supremacy of the Red Army over its potential enemies. Because in the Soviet Union, the military organization is dependent on the social and economic regime, and that's why we have the supremacy of our army over our enemies. This is seen through various publications and articles. For instance, to quote February 1938, an article that appeared in the Military Thought Review, a tribute to the 20th anniversary of the Red Army. They're talking about the fact that the Red Army is superior to its enemies, and there are 4 key parameters. They have powerful technology and equipment. Over the course of the Stalinist era, the best planes and tanks were created. The love of the people, because only under socialism can we have this unity of army and the people. It's the powerful leadership, because socialism led to the emergence of a new man and a new soldier, and the leadership of the party, because the Communist Party, led by Stalin, mobilizes people, including mobilizes them to fight, to work on fighting against the enemy of the people. These are the 4 characteristics that will keep being quoted. They're being reproduced, and this is a construct that's very persistent in all the publications. And every year, this rhetoric becomes louder and comes to the fore. If we compare 1938, 1939, and 1940, we'll see that there is an increase in the emphasis. On the one hand, it's ideological slogans that are not very interesting and are very well known, but I think that it would make sense in this case to highlight two aspects. On the one hand, the rigidity of the theory, as it gets more and more rigid, this materialistic theory, the Engels and Lenin political strategic analysis becomes more and more rigid, becomes more and more orthodox, and then it breaks down into two parts aligned with two areas of application. On the one hand, a strategic analysis of the military theory of the Western countries, the military organization of said countries, and the military histories. This is an area where military theoretical analysis, for instance, in 1937, becomes possible still. For instance, in Military Thought, which is a new review that appears, it was established in 1937, and the first editions of this newspaper contain an analysis of Legengard, Due's doctrine analysis. They also analyze military treaties of England, France, Japan, and Germany. This is where the strategy experts can perform the analysis. They analyze military campaigns of the past. They're broken down using materialistic Engels theory, using social economic analysis elements, and taking into account the social and economic context of the conflicts. That's the first area of application. The second area of application, or non-application, if you will, because when talking about the Soviet Union, this tool set cannot be applied, because applying theory in this instance would lead to politically unacceptable conclusions. It is therefore replaced by using these very rigid ideological formulas. The problem is this first area shrinks down very quickly. If back in 1937 in this new review, it's still possible to emphasize, and when talking about Due's doctrine, this air supremacy doctrine, or perhaps not even empathize, but to discuss in detail Fuller's ideas on the professional army. By 1938, these material practically disappear, or they have to be moved to the bibliography at the end of the magazine, and they start to be part of the criticism of bourgeois science, which is typical for Stalinist era. In 1937, in the first edition, there was a very interesting article by a journalist who was soon to be repressed on the Japanese army and the Japanese military strategy. In the 8th edition, in 1939, an article is published on the state of the Japanese army at Port Arthur, where they talk about the fact that the Japanese army has low spirits, there's nothing to talk about, and if the Japanese ever try to attack us, they will be defeated. The space for applying this theory for strategic analysis keeps shrinking. And these slogans, these set formulas, become prevalent. Another example of how this happens, using military history as our starting material, which military campaigns of the past would form the basis of knowledge for a military expert. It would be the First World War, the Civil War in Spain, the Japanese-Chinese War, to a lesser extent the Soviet-Polish War, a little bit of the Russian-Japanese War, Italo-Abessian War, and there were just 2 articles over the 4 years that I researched that were dedicated to 1812 and Suvorov's campaign. As you can see, this is a very limited horizon, essentially. On the one hand, that's understandable because we're talking about the more relevant points that are most interesting for military experts rather than historians. But on the other hand, the problem is, like, these are all conflicts that the authors are in one way or another engaged into. So gradually, they're forced to postulate the supremacy of the revolutionary soldier more and more, or this leading social regime. The cult of personality plays an important role in this. There's a whole series of publications over the course of the period that I researched where Stalin is the key inspirer, the key organizer of the victory in the Civil War. December 1939 is the apogee. This is the 60th anniversary of Stalin that's celebrated, and he is found responsible for all of the significant victories in the course of the entire Civil War. It's very interesting that this rigidity, progressive rigidity of the theory and using ready-made slogans and decisions is conscious. Researchers are aware of this process, and this need for a creative approach is talked over by the military leadership. The most quoted phrase from the military chart of 1936 is as follows. There are no templates. The instructions should be applied, taken into account the given circumstances and context. And one of the most dangerous conclusions and accusations by one of the authors to another is that they would be giving you templates or ready-made decisions. At the end of 1938, a lot of the authors would write a disclaimer. This is not a template, so this is not an instruction, in order to preemptively avoid potential claims and accusations. Another interesting point, this monopolization by the military leadership of the political agenda, or of what was termed as the Great Strategy in the 19th century, this relationship between politics and the military strategy at large, leads to the fact that military experts are forced to focus on tactical matters and operational matters. If we analyze the type of discussions that are led by the military community, what they would argue about, we'll see that these are mostly matters that have to do with operations, about how to organize tank operations, about whether we can use long-haul tanks. This is what we know from the World War, how these deep penetrations of bank armies can be used, using aviation, missiles, etc. So the very particular tactical matters that are being discussed. So on the one hand, it's normal, experts discussing the specialized topics. On the other hand, this leads to the fact that there is a discrepancy, there are no connection between various parts of the army. And they keep talking about it, that interaction is requirement, like air forces and tank forces need to interact. But essentially, it leads to these constant gaps and discrepancies, and military experts are being focused on the very specialized and narrow areas. I'm going to try to exemplify this, the way this would play out in an actual discussion. Okay, let me skip some of the elements I was going to cover because we're running out of time. But one point I did want to make is the priority of attack, which is a part of all of the military documents from 1936, 1939, when they talk about the fact that the Red Army is invincible, and the key goal of the Red Army is to lead to a victory through attacking the enemy. Even in some of the articles in the journal called Military Thought, organizing a defense, initially they would always state that defense is required as an auxiliary action and attack is always the first action to go with. You need to make a defensive attack, a strike with the army's fist, metaphorically. So there was no leadership indication for military experts, for officers in 1941. The political nature of this is very prevalent in the quote that I took as a title for my paper today. It's Kirill Mursakov, who was the head of the headquarters. He said this in December 1940. It was a discussion among the leadership, and he said there was a period of time when we were afraid to say that it was possible to put up a defense. This attack-oriented approach is exclusively political. Another 2 points that I wanted to raise that I think represent what this forced focus on tactical and operational matters leads to. In 1940, a book is published by a son called The New Forms of Combat. He analyzes the military campaigns in Spain, particularly the beginning of the Second World War, which was the German-Polish War, the way it was termed for us. He characterizes it as a new page in history. He shows what the military actions would be. So he's just sharing his analysis. It's exceptionally productive and constructive. Sometimes he actually describes what was going to happen in 1941 down to detail when Germany attacks the Soviet Union. He describes the mistakes of the Polish leadership. He talks about how to prevent these errors from occurring in the future. But the problem is, his analysis turns out to be too bold. He's too strategic. He steps beyond this limited area of tactics. This is where a military professional would be allowed to share their ideas and analysis, how to organize the interrelation between various divisions when attacking the military camp. This analysis definitely steps beyond these limits. And then Esterson was arrested in 1941. He was accused of unacceptable rhetoric towards leadership, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. A year before he was arrested at the meeting in 1940, Klonov, who was the head of the Baltic military garrison, he said that I had a look at Esterson's book and he makes hasty conclusions based on the Polish-German War. I think that these conclusions are premature. They are allowed for such a state as Poland that have lost all vigilance. They had no knowledge of what the Germans were doing over the course of this time. So they're making conclusions on the fact that we shouldn't listen to what he was talking about because we are the leaders, so we have the supreme army, and this is nothing that can happen to us. Essentially, in terms of operations art, the same approach is demonstrated by Zhukov in his speech before the Supreme Leadership. He talks about his own experience against the Japanese, and he shows how flanks, how wings can attack, how they can surround the enemy. So essentially, he's analyzing some military context, and this is an example of the same. This is what Germans are doing in Poland in 1939, and the conclusions that are done at operations level are practically the same. They practically repeat what Esterson was talking about. But what Zhukov says remains at this tactical level. He discusses, for instance, the optimal depth of the attack, the supply of fuel. He does not make any political or strategic conclusions from his analysis. He does say that we need to prepare for attack operations, that we need to be flexible, that we need to be coordinated between various types of troops. So essentially, he arrives at exactly the same conclusions that all of the other researchers. And the discussion in December 1940 is Tymoshenko, the defense minister, says something that seems startling today, but in the context of this material, sounds very predictable. It's very logical. He says, in terms of the strategic conceptualization, the European experience would add nothing new to our understanding of the situation. In terms of tactics, there are significant changes that are taking place. So in his opinion, the actions of the Germans only confirm the Soviet tactical principles, and we should not be the ones that are led by their experience. So in terms of attacking, they should learn from us. Those that want to learn advanced ways of attack needs to look at our operations. And in Karelia, all of these matters are of strategic value, strategic issues are not directly drawn from the specialized understanding that the military professionals will have. They have a good understanding in terms of what's going to be happening if a tank unit attacks. They can describe the issues that we might be facing in terms of military supplies, or fuel supplies, but the strategic level, which is above this tactical level, is not directly derived from an analysis of the operational situation. And at the end of the 1930s, this level is taken by political rhetoric, which essentially is monopolized by the political leadership, and Stalin personally recreating these political slogans leads to the tragedy of 1941. On the other hand, another point that's worth making here, and I'm mostly focused here on the theory, but a huge role, of course, is also played by what's behind this, the fear of military leadership. Everybody who was coming up with original strategic analysis of the situation, the ex-officers of the Tsar army that were fluent in foreign languages, that knew this global political and war theory, they were able to offer strategic analysis, even in line with this Marxist and Engels logics, but they find themselves repressed by the 1930s. Svechin, Slesrev, the ones that I mentioned, they are repressed, and many others. And in the Military Thought Journal, we start to see articles that start to say that thanks to the political leadership, we managed to figure out the situation with our spies, fascism apologists within our army, and now we have become even stronger. What this fear leads to is a professional deformation, this isolation, this narrow specialization on very narrow professional areas. And I hope I managed to show this. This does not lead to a proper assessment of the strategic situation, and leads to the defeat at the beginning of the Second World War. Thank you. Egor, thank you so much for your presentation. Colleagues, are there any questions or comments or feedback? Egor, thank you so much. It's a really interesting analysis. This ideological violence and this level of ideological violence, you presented that very well, what it all leads to. It'll be just interesting to note that starting from the beginning of the war and the catastrophe of 1941, did strategic planning come back to the army, the Soviet army? Were they forced to come back to strategic planning? So what happened after? We needed to participate in the war. We needed to plan the war. Was there a partial recovery of strategic thinking in the army? Egor, well, I didn't focus on this specifically, but I would say no. One of the aspects that's well described in historical literature is the intrusion of Stalin, his interference into military planning. For instance, the Kiev operations, following direct orders from Stalin that we needed to defend ourselves, we needed to put up an opposition. The military were forced to agree with the political leadership, or they had to step aside and give them path. Where a few years ago, they would analyze military actions, Stalin's actions, who has been tributed with all of the successes during the Civil War. We start to see signs, initial signs, and this trope that Stalin is the organizer. He's the one who inspired all of the victories, and he continues to remain the inspirer in our historical consciousness. I don't really remember off the top of my head right now, but in one of the battles where Stalin acted as this political consultant, when the military experts say, this contradicts military science altogether, Stalin says, well, the worst for, well, whatever, it's the problem of military science. That's his classical way of approaching this. And the military are forced to accept this as part of their professional positioning, because the political leadership would know best. During the war, both like officers and military leadership would learn to think strategically, but in terms of the military theory, they never go back to the level that military strategy was at in the 1920s and the 1930s. And in my analysis, I'm showing this, analyzing late Soviet military texts. So there is no recovery. Irina, so roughly speaking, well, just to ask a simple question, the victory in the war, was this something that happened despite lack of strategic planning? Okay, 1941, everybody was lost, everybody was feeling defeated, but then they engaged Rokossovsky, and then there was a lot of strategizing, so they must have been planning something, right? So we would have not won in the war, even given the price that we had to pay, if it was all down, limited to operational and tactical thinking. Egor, well, definitely. We're just talking about slightly different level of competency from the professional military experts in Germany. In England, a military expert could say, well, this is the way we need to prepare the newly recruited soldiers, or we need to have a professional army, or we need to build submarines instead of military aircraft. So in the Soviet Union, a military expert would never ask these questions. This is something that was given to the political leadership to decide. Olga, thank you very much. We have a question from Arseny. Arseny, thank you so much, Egor. As usual, very interesting. I wanted to specify one point that you made over the course of the 1930s and towards the end of the 1930s. There was this serious purging of the political military community. A military is not somebody who can say something, who has a voice, who can make any political statements or decisions. But nonetheless, if you were to compare this situation with the previous period, the 1920s, the beginning of the 1930s, what would be admissible, would you say, for a military professional that is trying to reflect not only on military matters, but who's trying to tackle matters of a higher level? Can they make any political or philosophical statements? Is there any freedom that they have in this? Do they have the right to make strategic statements? Towards the end of the 1930s, as you said, this is fully something that's handed over to the political leadership, Egor. Yes, well, they are thinking about the strategy, of course, but you need to understand that when we talk about the strategy in the classical understanding of strategy, something that was formed over the course of the 19th century, the high-level strategy, the so-called great strategy, are all matters that have to do with this intercorrelation between the political and the military. And this was addressed differently. The extreme level that Levendorf suggests in his book on total war, where he makes the political subject to the military. Military experts usually would not claim such a big role, but nonetheless, they discuss matters that are part of their strategic problems, that everything has to do with the war, but they also pertain to what we call politics, so like which geographic region should be attached to the country. The Germans would discuss this when they talk about France, for instance, when Alsace and Thuringia, for instance, how roads should be built, how fortresses should be built, what types of weapons need to be developed first and foremost, how recruiting should be organized, how soldiers should be prepared starting from school, everything that has to do with strategy. And this whole pool of questions steps beyond this narrow understood military competencies. Over the course of the 19th and 20th century, in all the countries, the military would discuss these matters and looking at articles that analyze Western texts. Soviet officers also had this competency. They could support these discussions. It's just they were not allowed when applied to the Soviet Union. At the beginning, straight after the revolution, there is this window of opportunity that comes about. And Slesary, for instance, writes a course in, I think, 1919 for headquarter officers called The Philosophy of War, suggesting that Soviet officers at the headquarters would discuss Tolstoy's ideas and Vladimir Solovyov ideas, and this course was never launched. Over the course of the 1920s, it's a very constructive intellectual discussion. These are people that were properly educated at the Nikolai Headquarters Academy, and as in other intellectual spheres, they perceive it as an opportunity to talk about things that were not talked about before, but it very quickly turns out that the boundaries start to shrink, and by the 1930s, it turns out that this whole area of strategic thinking is completely restricted, and they are limited to talking about tactics, about how to properly organize the troops, how to attack, how the tanks and the aircraft should coordinate their actions when bombing. Very, very specific matters. Olga, thank you so much. There is another question from Igor. Igor, thank you so much. I wanted to specify, is there the danger of this rigidity in the thinking? Was it ever discussed? Are there any documented evidence that it was perceived as something that was dangerous, or it wasn't discussed at any level at all? Igor, well, they discussed it, yes, of course. The issue here is rather of this discrepancy If you look at the charters, when they talk about defense and attack, the gap there is huge. If you're just a regular officer, you open your charter. This is something you should be guided by the military code. And I can't give you the number of pages, like 30 pages on attack and 1 page on defense. This is the imbalance that you would find. In the magazine, of course, they discuss defense. There are various ways to approach, like sometimes they make this disclaimer that we're going to talk about defense, because when we defend, we need to limit the enemy troops, and somewhere else our troops are going to be attacking. So in this sense, defense plays this auxiliary support function required to support the attack, and that's why we're going to talk about it. For military experts, this is a normal way to present this. It is debated, it is discussed, but this is a problem that when it comes to political decision making, they have to say that the Red Army is the supreme army that's going to strike and defeat the enemy. That's the way they have to pitch it. When Yeserson starts to talk about the danger of being attacked, then he's momentarily silenced and repressed, and his texts are somehow banned. Olga, thank you so much. Colleagues, I guess we have to move on to our last speaker. We're a little bit behind schedule, so we're going to thank Egor for the discussion.